They said our tanks were blind that morning, but blindness was not the word. It was something deeper, a silence that crawled beneath the steel into our bones. We watched through the narrow glass of our Panzer as American Shermans appeared from the smoke, moving not as machines but as a single living organism. No flares, no signals, no visible command, just motion, perfect and fluid, like a school of fish beneath dark water. We aimed, fired, shouted into our radios, but all we heard was static, the desperate hiss of a world slipping out of our control. And in that moment, something inside us broke. We realized the war was no longer fought with shells and armor. It was fought in the air between them, in the invisible, in the silence we could not conquer. We had once believed in superiority, German precision, German logic, German design. We built tanks that could crush anything on land. We called them invincible. But as we advanced through Africa and Italy, that illusion shattered. The Americans had built something else, not stronger, not faster, but connected. Their voices traveled through dust and chaos, as if guided by the hand of God. Ours died the moment we spoke them. Every order we gave was swallowed by interference. Every cry for help dissolved into nothing. We thought we had mastered technology, but we had only mastered isolation. Inside those steel beasts, we began to feel what no soldier dares admit, fear not of death but of irrelevance. The battlefield was no longer a place of courage or glory. It had become an orchestra, and we were the deaf. The enemy did not outnumber us, they outheard us. And when their tanks moved as one, it was as if the earth itself had chosen a side. What we witnessed in that desert was more than defeat. It was the birth of something new, a kind of warfare that would make the old world vanish. We did not understand it then. We only knew that the air around us had changed, filled with whispers we could not translate, signals that carried command, purpose, unity. While we stumbled through smoke and static, the Americans were building something invisible, something that would outlive us all. And that is where this story begins. Not with gunfire, but with a frequency, a quiet pulse that rewrote the fate of nations. The day we lost was the day they learned to speak across the noise. The first thing I remember was not the explosions, nor the heat. It was the silence that came before, a silence so heavy it pressed against the skin, as if the world was holding its breath. Then came the sound, not of engines or shells, but of something far stranger. A rhythm, distant yet exact. We thought it was artillery at first, or maybe an approaching column, but when we saw them, the American Shermans, moving through the morning fog, we understood something was wrong. They did not move like us. They did not hesitate, shout, or signal. They flowed. They moved as though the earth itself whispered directions only they could hear. From my Panzer, I could see them converging, 5 tanks separated by ridges and smoke, yet turning and firing in perfect unison. It was as if they could see through the dust, as if they shared one vision, one thought. For years we Germans had believed ourselves masters of coordination. We wrote the doctrine. We trained in precision. But that morning, north of Kasserine Pass, all our confidence turned to confusion. Our radios cracked and screamed. Orders came half-sentences. Then static. The airwaves were a storm. We were deaf, blind, alone. I shouted into my receiver, asking for positions. No answer. Only the mechanical hiss of a machine drowning in its own noise. And still, the Shermans advanced. It was not their guns that frightened me. It was their silence. How do you fight an enemy that speaks without sound, that moves without chaos, that kills without rage? For the first time, I felt something I had never felt in a tank before. Not the fear of death, but the fear of being obsolete. We fired anyway. Our 75mm shells cut through smoke and dust. One of their tanks stopped. For a moment we believed we had regained the rhythm. But before we could reposition, 3 others came around the flank as if they had already predicted our move. They fired not at us, but at where we would be. They were thinking faster, moving faster, deciding faster. We had no words for it then, but now I know what we were witnessing. They were connected. We did not understand it, but their technology spoke where ours stuttered. Their voices, transmitted through the air, clear and instant, allowed them to act like a single creature. While our words were trapped inside walls of interference, theirs sliced through the chaos. Every command, every warning, every cry for help traveled with precision. We who once prided ourselves on German engineering were fighting ghosts of a new kind, ghosts made of signal and clarity. Later I learned that each of those American tanks carried a radio unlike anything we had. A machine called the SCR-508, built by men in factories far from the front. To us, radios were fragile tools. To them, it was their heartbeat. While our transmitters gasped through the dust, theirs sang through the noise. Our technology spoke in weakness, theirs spoke in certainty. In that difference, entire lives were decided. As the battle went on, we tried to adapt. We sent runners between tanks, a desperate attempt to restore communication. One was cut down before he reached halfway. Another vanished in the smoke. The Americans didn't need runners, they didn't need flags or flares. They had voices that traveled faster than death. Every tank knew where the others were, what they saw, what they feared. It was as if their minds had merged into one. We, meanwhile, remained trapped in our separate shells, literally and figuratively. When the battle ended, the field was quiet. The silence returned, but it felt different this time. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of realization. We had lost something greater than a skirmish. We had lost our certainty that we understood war. Our commanders told us it was bad luck, bad terrain, bad coordination. But deep down, we knew the truth. The war had changed. It was no longer about who had the thicker armor or the better aim. It was about who could think as one. After the battle, in the cold of that night, I sat outside the tank watching the horizon flicker with distant fire. I could still hear the faint crackle of our broken radios, whispering useless fragments. Someone was calling for command. Someone else was reporting casualties. I listened, but the words dissolved before they reached meaning. That night I thought about something strange, how we Germans had once believed we could control everything with order and precision. Yet, here amid the chaos, the Americans had found control in freedom, unity in noise. They trusted their machines, but more than that, they trusted the link between them. I wondered what it must feel like to fight and never be alone. To know that at any moment someone hears you, someone answers. For us, the radio had become a symbol of isolation. For them, it was salvation. And I could not stop thinking, what would it be like to be part of something that large, that alive? The next days brought only retreat. We moved through broken terrain, still haunted by what we had seen. The higher command dismissed it. They said the Americans had been lucky, that their tanks were inferior, their tactics simple. But in private, whispers spread through the ranks. We began to speak of the Shermans not as machines, but as a phenomenon, as if they carried something beyond steel and fire. Some said their radios were tuned to secret frequencies. Others joked bitterly that they were guided by angels of war. I knew it was neither. I knew it was something we could not yet name. The beginning of a world where machines would think together. In the following weeks, I wrote in my small notebook, trying to capture what I had felt in that moment of helpless awe. I wrote that war had become invisible, that victory would no longer depend on who could shout the loudest, but who could listen the deepest. The Americans had built a web, and we were caught outside of it. We were still fighting as individuals in a war that now demanded unity. And unity, we learned too late, cannot be manufactured overnight. I sometimes ask myself why that moment stayed with me. It wasn't the explosions or the losses. It was the realization that our enemy had evolved, and we had not. They had found a way to make machines speak truth faster than humans could. And in that, they had found something almost spiritual. It wasn't just communication, it was communion. While we spoke in fragments, they answered in harmony. Years later, after the war ended, I came across a captured American manual, worn and folded. Inside it was a diagram of the SCR-508 system. I studied it for hours, simple, elegant, purposeful. It wasn't the machine itself that shocked me, it was the philosophy behind it. Every tank mattered, Every crew was heard, every voice counted. In our army, hierarchy ruled. In theirs, connection ruled. And perhaps that was why, in the end, they prevailed. When I think of that day now, I do not think of defeat as humiliation. I think of it as revelation. We had fought a war of isolation and discovered a world of networks. We had built fortresses of steel while they built bridges of sound. It was not the size of their guns that changed history, but the reach of their voices. Sometimes I wonder, if we had understood sooner, could things have been different? Could we have built machines that listened instead of shouted? Could we have learned to share thoughts instead of orders? These questions still haunt me. Perhaps the real tragedy of that war was not that we lost it, but that we never understood the one we were truly fighting. And as I close my eyes, I still see them. Those tanks gliding through the smoke, silent and sure, their movements bound by an invisible thread. I hear their voices, faint but clear, cutting through the chaos. I hear unity. I hear the future. And I know now, that was the day the silence died and something greater began. They say the future is born in silence. For us, it began in the hum of machines we did not yet understand. Months after Kasserine, when the smoke of defeat had settled, we began to hear whispers of a mystery, a story told in fragments among captured reports and intercepted transmissions. The Americans, it seemed, were fighting a different kind of war, one built not on armor or bravery, but on an invisible web that held them together. Some of us refused to believe it. Others, like me, could not stop thinking about it. Back then, in 1942, while our engineers in Berlin focused on armor thickness and muzzle velocity, men across the ocean in Chicago were building something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more powerful. They worked in the Motorola factory, a name we barely knew then, turning radios into weapons. Not weapons that killed, but weapons that connected. Every bolt, every crystal, every dial was designed not to command, but to communicate. They understood something we did not. That unity was the strongest armor of all. I later learned the names of two of them, Daniel Noble and Henryk Magnuski. They were not soldiers, not generals, not even famous. But their creation, the SCR-508, would decide battles we had not yet fought. It transmitted with clarity where ours only screamed in static. It held frequency steady while our signals drifted like ghosts. It gave every tank a voice, every crew a presence. While we spoke through hierarchy, they spoke through harmony. And in war, harmony moves faster than rank. You might think that these details belong only to the past, to dusty museums and forgotten manuals. But look closer. The story of those radios is not just about machines. It is about human connection, about what happens when communication breaks, in war, in life, in everything. Think of it. How many times have you lost something important simply because the message didn't reach the other side? How many times has silence, misunderstanding, or pride created a distance that words could have bridged? That was our war, a war of missed signals. The Americans understood that even the smallest voice could carry meaning if it reached the right ears. They built their army like a family that never lost touch. We built ours like a fortress that no one could enter. When our command tanks were destroyed, so were our voices. When theirs were lost, the next tank simply took command. Their system was alive, ours was rigid. And in war, the living always devour the mechanical. I remember one evening, weeks after Italy had turned into another graveyard of ambition. We sat by the wreckage of our vehicles drinking bitter coffee from dented cups. A young radio operator named Franz was staring at his broken receiver. He said quietly, "Maybe we lost because they can talk, and we only listen." None of us answered, but every man there knew he was right. We had become a nation of listeners, waiting for orders that never came, waiting for messages that could no longer be sent. The next morning, I found that same boy dead beside his tank. A shell had torn through the turret. His hand was still on the receiver, as if waiting for one last reply. I cannot forget that image. Even now it reminds me that every battle, every failure, begins with silence. The silence between what is said and what is heard. And still, the world around us moved forward. The Americans turned their invisible advantage into something unstoppable. Operation Torch, Italy, Normandy. Each new campaign revealed that their strength came not from how loud they shouted, but from how clearly they listened. Their radios didn't just connect tanks, they connected men. Across distance, across chaos, across fear. They fought like a mind that refused to fragment. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if we had seen it earlier. If someone in Berlin had stopped counting rivets and started listening to frequencies, could we have changed the outcome? Could we have found unity before defeat forced it upon us? I do not know. But I do know this. War does not always reveal who is stronger. It reveals who is wiser. And in that war, wisdom belonged to those who learned to listen. Perhaps that is why this story still matters. It is not just a chronicle of machines or history books. It is a mirror. You can see it in every part of modern life. The companies that rise are those that communicate. The families that endure are those that stay connected. Even in our own minds, the voices that survive are the ones that listen. Every silence we ignore, every message we fail to send, is a small Kasserine of our own making. We lost not because we lacked courage, but because we fought disconnected. The Americans did not fear confusion. They turned it into rhythm. They made technology serve unity, not ego. And when you think about it, isn't that the battle we are still fighting today? To stay connected in a world full of noise, to hear one another before the silence wins again. I can still hear the faint hum of the radio that changed everything. It was not music, not speech, just a steady tone, a heartbeat. To the Americans, it was coordination. To us, it was the sound of something we had lost, the ability to be one. That invisible thread that tied them together also tied them to the future. And maybe, just maybe, that future still speaks to us. Because when we look at our world now, our phones, our networks, our endless communication, it is the same story in a new form. The same invisible waves that carried the voices of those Sherman crews now carry ours. The same principle still rules. Connection means survival. Disconnection means defeat. If you are listening to this now, if you have followed the story this far, it is because you, too, are searching for connection, to understand how the invisible shapes the visible. So before we continue, let me ask you one thing. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden truths of this war, truths that few dare to tell from the side that lost, click the red button somewhere in the corner of your screen. Subscribe. Not because of algorithms or numbers, but because stories like this deserve to stay alive. We tell them not to glorify defeat, but to learn from it, to ensure we never fall silent again. In the next chapter, we will see how that same invisible network grew into something greater, how the Americans turned their radios into an empire of awareness, and how our ignorance of it led to our undoing. But for now, remember this. In every war and in every life, the first victory always belongs to those who know how to listen. When the reports from Africa reached Europe, most of us dismissed them. Tales of tanks moving like ghosts, of American coordination that defied explanation, they sounded exaggerated, almost superstitious. But when we reached Italy, the truth revealed itself, and it was worse than we could have imagined. The terrain there was merciless. Mountains that swallowed sound, valleys that bent sight, fog that clung to every hill. Communication should have been impossible for both sides, yet somehow for them it wasn't. We were stationed near Monte Cassino when I first heard it. Through the static of our own failing radios came fragments of clear foreign voices, American voices, crisp, calm, alive. They spoke in sentences that carried no echo, no distortion. It was like hearing order born inside chaos. Our own equipment choked on the same air. The German FUG-5, once our pride, sputtered like an old man gasping for air. Its 10 watts of power were nothing against the stone and smoke that surrounded us. Every message we sent faded halfway through the mountains. We lived in a world of broken transmissions. Their world, however, was different. The SCR-508 radios, with their strange frequency modulation, worked as if the terrain did not exist. The Americans seemed to talk through the rocks, through the storms, through the noise itself. We saw it happen again and again. Platoons separated by kilometers, still moving, as if connected by a single mind. We thought it was luck. It wasn't. It was not until a captured Sherman was brought to a maintenance depot that I saw the truth with my own eyes. Inside the steel walls, there it was, a small box, heavy but simple, labeled SCR-508. The dials were clean, the channels numbered. The operator could switch frequencies in seconds, each tuned by crystal, immune to drift. I stared at it for a long time. How could something so small change everything we thought we knew about war? Have you ever seen something that made you question everything you believed in? That day I did. I realized that power no longer came from the size of a gun or the thickness of armor. It came from something invisible, from communication that transcended barriers. We were building machines to fight. They were building systems to think. During one ambush near the village of Aquino, I saw their coordination again. A German artillery strike had cut off a group of Shermans. They were isolated, trapped in the valley, or so we thought. Within minutes, before we could press the attack, reinforcements arrived, not from behind, but from the flank. Perfect timing, perfect positioning. They should not have known where to go, but they did. They always did. We searched the skies for spotter planes, the hills for signal flares. There were none, only that eerie, invisible connection. It was as if the mountains themselves spoke to them, telling them where to strike, where to move, when to survive. We were fighting men who no longer needed eyes, only voices. Why didn't we see it sooner? Perhaps pride blinded us. Or maybe we were too busy perfecting the past to notice the birth of the future. Our generals wrote about discipline, about precision, about hierarchy, but their strength came from improvisation, from trust. When one tank fell, another took command without hesitation. They were not waiting for permission. They were reacting as one organism, each part alive with purpose. The difference was psychological as much as technological. Our soldiers followed orders. Theirs followed awareness. We believed in control. They believed in connection. And when connection meets control, connection always wins. As the campaign dragged on, we began to notice something more disturbing. The Americans were adapting faster than we could study them. After the hedgerow battles in Normandy, they had discovered a fatal flaw in their system. Their tanks could not talk directly to their infantry. Any other army might have spent months fixing it. The Americans solved it in weeks. They welded telephones onto their tanks, letting infantry pick up the receiver and speak directly to the crew. It was so simple, so absurd, that none of our engineers would have suggested it. And yet, it worked perfectly. That moment stayed with me because it showed the difference between invention and understanding. We Germans invented endlessly, but they understood humanity. They knew that in war, survival depended not on machines, but on the ability to connect one human mind to another. One night I sat with a captured American mechanic, a quiet man from Ohio. I asked him what made his army so quick to adapt. He thought for a moment and said, "Because our men can talk to anyone." I laughed, thinking he was joking. But he wasn't. That was their secret. It wasn't just the radios, it was the culture behind them. A culture that valued every voice, that believed every soldier could think. While we were bound by hierarchy, they were liberated by communication. Do you see how dangerous that is? A mind that listens grows faster than a mind that commands. The Americans were no longer an army, they were an ecosystem. Every failure taught them something new, and every success became shared wisdom in minutes. We, meanwhile, drowned in paperwork, waiting for permission from dead men. By 1944, their invisible advantage had become something close to prophecy. They could coordinate artillery, tanks, and infantry with such speed that our strategies became obsolete the moment we wrote them. The battlefield we had once mastered was slipping away. The war was no longer about who fired first. It was about who communicated first, and they always did. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to witness your own obsolescence? It is not anger nor fear. It is silence, the kind of silence that fills a room after a funeral. You realize the world has moved on, and you are still fighting yesterday's war. After the battles in Italy, we retreated north, broken but not yet defeated. Still, the question haunted me. Could we ever catch up? Could we build what they had built, a network of minds instead of a chain of command? The answer came too late. Our factories could copy their designs, but not their philosophy. You cannot mass-produce trust. You cannot standardize unity. We had entered a new era without knowing it. The Americans had turned technology into empathy, and empathy into strategy. They listened to their machines, to each other, to the pulse of the battlefield. We listened only to rank. That is why they moved as one, and we fell apart. Years later, historians would call it the birth of network warfare. But for those of us who lived it, it felt like something deeper, like the awakening of a new consciousness. We had fought against machines that were no longer just machines. They were extensions of human thought, connected by invisible lines that stretched across battlefields and time itself. And I still ask myself, if every war reveals a truth about humanity, what truth did this one reveal about us? That isolation, no matter how armored, cannot survive the age of connection. That silence, no matter how disciplined, will always lose to the sound of understanding. In the end, it was never just about technology. It was about evolution. Americans had evolved. We had not. And when evolution begins, no doctrine, no tradition, no empire can stop it. By the time we reached France, the war had changed shape. It was no longer a matter of who had the most tanks or the strongest armor. It had become something unseen, a war of signals, of invisible strength flowing through the air. Normandy was chaos, but within that chaos, there was a strange rhythm. The Americans landed with precision that felt impossible. Each Sherman tank rolling onto the beach was not an isolated machine. It was a single note in a vast orchestra. Their voices moved through the noise, through the gunfire, through the death surrounding them. We, who once believed ourselves masters of order, could only watch as their disorder became harmony. We had heard that their radios could talk not only between tanks, but also with ships and aircraft. When their tanks advanced inland, they were still speaking to the sea. Naval fire adjusted in real time, shells falling exactly where their armored columns pointed. It seemed unreal, artillery guided not by maps, but by conversation. Meanwhile, our own batteries fought blind, firing into smoke and praying the coordinates were still correct. Our commanders did not understand that the Americans were no longer fighting a battle of sight, but a battle of sound. The numbers themselves were shocking. By 1944, over 49,000 Sherman tanks had been built. Every single one carrying an SCR-508 radio. More than 50,000 radio sets left the Motorola factories in Chicago, each piece identical, each capable of speaking to every other. They were creating not an army, but a living system. German production, by contrast, was collapsing. Out of roughly 12,000 operational medium and heavy tanks, fewer than 6,000 had both transmitters and receivers. The rest were half-deaf, listening but unable to speak. It was as if our army had been born. Mute. During the hedgerow battles that followed the landings, something extraordinary happened. The Americans realized that even their near-perfect communication had limits. Their tanks could not talk directly to their infantry. Many died because of that silence. German Panzerfaust teams crept close through the dense hedgerows, unseen and unstoppable. For a brief moment, we felt that balance return. But then, within weeks, they solved it. Soldiers began attaching field. Telephones to the backs of tanks, wires running into the armor so that infantry could speak directly to the crew. They welded them with their own hands. It was crude, improvised, and brilliant. They turned every tank into a shared heartbeat. What kind of people do that in the middle of war? People who adapt faster than destruction. People who refuse to accept silence. That realization chilled me more than any weapon we faced. Operation Cobra in July 1944 was the purest expression of their new warfare. I was positioned near St. Lo when the American artillery began. The ground trembled for hours. We thought it was another bombardment, but it wasn't. It was coordination at a scale we could not even imagine. 200 tanks moved through shattered villages as one, responding instantly to commands relayed through their radios. When one unit encountered resistance, others adjusted without hesitation. Our own responses lagged minutes behind, an eternity in battle. They were rewriting the laws of time. German divisions that had once crushed Europe found themselves trapped in confusion. The Panzer Lehr division, our pride, our most elite, was shattered in days. Tanks with thicker armor and better guns were useless when cut off from each other. Their radios failed, their lines broke. Many crews fought alone, unaware that the battle had already shifted miles away. It was not technology alone that defeated us. It was their ability to see beyond the moment, to hear the future before it arrived. Some historians later said that Germany was 5 years behind in communication. But those 5 years were more than time. They were destiny. We had built our weapons to conquer the present. They had built theirs to conquer what came next. And yet, even then, most of our high command refused to understand. They saw radios as accessories, not lifelines. They still believed in flags, messengers, hierarchy. They still believed the enemy won by chance, not by design. But for those of us who had faced the Shermans, who had watched them move as one mind, there was no doubt. We were witnessing something that transcended war, a shift in the nature of power itself. I remember the first time I saw the inside of a destroyed American tank after Operation Cobra. Amid the wreckage, I noticed their radio system still glowing faintly. It was blackened, cracked, but still alive. Even in death, their machines seemed to communicate. It felt almost sacred, a symbol of what we had never achieved. They had built technology that refused to die. By late 1944, the war was bleeding into Germany itself. The radio waves that once carried our confidence now carried our desperation. American columns advanced faster than we could react. Their coordination allowed them to move entire divisions as if they were a single creature. We could no longer predict their tactics because they no longer needed tactics. They had awareness. When they reached the Rhine, everything changed again. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen became a legend among us. It was not luck. It was connection. Within minutes of the discovery, American forces communicated across miles, coordinating reinforcements, artillery, and air support. Before our own command even knew the bridge still existed, their radios had become faster than thought itself. Within an hour, they held the crossing that sealed our fate. What did we have left? Broken lines, shattered cables, radios that screamed but no longer answered. The war was ending, and we could not even hear it happen. In the Ruhr pocket of 1945, surrounded and cut off, I saw the full weight of our silence. Over 300,000 German soldiers trapped, a third of them armored units. But we could not coordinate, could not regroup. Our signals were gone, our voices lost in the air. I remember the sound of our radios that last night, a faint hiss, the echo of ghosts trying to speak. Field Marshal Model's final transmission was barely audible. No contact with higher headquarters, no contact with adjacent units. Fighting continues, but coordination impossible. Then nothing. Imagine the terror of that silence, an army cut from its own soul. We did not surrender to strength. We surrendered to connection. The Americans had made war into a network, and we were still fighting alone. After the surrender, when the war finally ended, I expected relief. Instead, there was only emptiness. We had built the strongest tanks in history, yet they had lost to voices carried by air. I could not accept it at first. How could something so invisible, so intangible, have defeated the weapons we trusted with our lives? But then I saw the data collected by the Allied teams. They measured everything: signal strength, power output, frequency range. Our FUG-5 radios, they said, transmitted at 10 watts. The American SCR-508 transmitted at 25. Their range was 3 times ours. Their stability was perfect, crystal controlled. Their coordination rate? 100%, ours 20. They had achieved something we never understood: complete unity. Every tank, every soldier, part of a single web of communication. No army in history had ever achieved that. It was not just progress, it was evolution. And then came the realization that hit even harder. The Soviets, our former enemies, would soon copy the Americans, not us. They studied the captured equipment and rebuilt their future around it. Even decades later, every modern tank, Leopard, Abrams, T-72, carries the echo of that same design. The war did not end with their victory. It continued silently in every signal, every command network, every digital whisper. That defines modern conflict. Sometimes I think about the irony of it all. Germany had invented blitzkrieg, the art of speed and coordination, but by the end we were fighting like statues while the world moved in rhythm. We had become relics of our own doctrine. And so the last truth of our defeat revealed itself. We lost not because we were weaker, but because we were alone. The Americans taught the world that information is power, that unity is a weapon stronger than any gun. We had armor, they had connection, and in the end, connection always wins. When I walk through the museums now, I see the old tanks, their radios dark and silent. Children point at them with curiosity, unaware that inside those metal shells lies the story of humanity's greatest transformation, the moment when war ceased to be a clash of machines and became a dialogue of minds. It is strange to think that victory was carried not by bullets, but by frequencies. The invisible won against the visible. The voice conquered the cannon. And in that shift, we saw the future take shape, a future where isolation would always lose to connection. The Americans built a new world from that principle. The radios that spoke through the dust of Tunisia and the fog of Italy became the ancestors of everything we use today. The phones, the satellites, the networks that bind our planet. They built not just machines of war, but bridges of understanding. And we who once believed ourselves chosen to lead the modern age, became its first ghosts. Our silence became a warning, our defeat a lesson. In the end, every empire that stops listening begins to fall. Every army that isolates itself becomes its own prisoner. That is what we learned too late. That the strongest force on any battlefield is not fear or discipline or armor, it is connection. It is the voice that carries through the smoke, that binds men to each other, that refuses to be silenced. The Americans had it, we did not. And that difference changed the world forever. The war ended, but its echo never stopped. It lived in the static of the radios we abandoned, in the silence that filled our cities, and in the faces of the men who came home and no longer knew who they were. We had lost the war, yes, but not only on the battlefield. We had lost it inside ourselves, in the part of the human spirit that refused to listen. When the surrender was signed, many of us believed that silence meant peace. It did not. Silence is not peace. It is only the space where reflection begins. In those first months after the fall, we tried to understand what had really happened. Our defeat had numbers, yes. Factories destroyed, divisions dissolved, lives lost by the millions. But none of those explained the deeper truth, that we had built an empire of isolation. We had armored ourselves not only against our enemies, but against understanding itself. The Americans had built bridges while we built walls. And in the end, the bridges stood. When I think back to those days, what I remember most is not the battles or the machines, but the feeling of disconnection. Every soldier felt it, the sense that we were shouting into the void, hoping someone would hear us. We had leaders who spoke of destiny and superiority, but in the field we could not even reach each other. How can a nation claim to lead the world when its own sons cannot communicate across a few kilometers of terrain? That was our real defeat, the loss of unity. The Americans had none of our grandeur, but they had something far greater: clarity. Their voices reached from tank to tank, from land to sea, from soldier to command. They trusted not in symbols or perfection, but in contact. While we looked upward for guidance, they looked sideways, to each other. That made them stronger than we ever understood. Theirs was not a victory of might, but of connection, and connection, once born, cannot be conquered. Over time, I learned the technical details of what had beaten us. I studied the reports written after the war, German, American, Soviet. They all told the same story. The SCR-508 radios that filled the American tanks transmitted at 25 watts with crystal control so precise it never drifted. Their communication range extended for miles even in motion. Our own FUG-5 systems transmitted less than half that power. In motion, they barely carried a message beyond a few hundred meters. The more we advanced, the less we could hear. The more powerful we became, the lonelier we grew. But it was not only about machines, it was about philosophy. We had designed a system that demanded obedience. They had designed one that rewarded initiative. We believed in silence. They believed in conversation. And that is why when the world turned to ashes, their voice carried through the smoke, and ours disappeared beneath it. It is strange to look back now and realize how much of the future began in that invisible revolution. The principles that guided their radio networks became the foundation of our modern world. Every satellite, every internet signal, every digital connection owes its birth to that war, to that moment when communication proved stronger than destruction. Even now, when you pick up a phone or send a message, you are using the same invisible waves that once decided the fate of nations. You are living inside the echo of that discovery. And yet, I still think about what we lost. Not the territory, not the pride, but the understanding. We could have been part of that future, we could have learned from it. But we chose the path of isolation, and it destroyed us. That is the greatest lesson of the war, and it has nothing to do with politics or armies. It is about the human heart. The moment we stop listening, we begin to fall. The moment we refuse to connect, we create our own defeat. There is something else I wish to tell you, something I have carried in silence for years. Many of us who fought and survived did not see ourselves as monsters or heroes. We were simply men trapped inside the noise of history, following orders we did not write. But history remembers differently. It remembers winners and losers, not listeners and learners. That is why I am telling this story, so that those who come after us do not mistake silence for strength. If you look around today, you will see the same danger everywhere. Nations shouting across borders, people screaming through screens, everyone talking, but no one truly hearing. The same disease that destroyed us still lives, the disease of disconnection. And if we do not learn from it, it will consume us again. History does not repeat itself. It waits for us to stop listening. I sometimes imagine what it would be like if those old radios could still speak. What would they say to us? Perhaps they would remind us that communication is not just technology, it is empathy. That the power of a voice lies not in how loud it is, but in how deeply it reaches another. That unity is not control but understanding. The Americans won because they built machines that reflected their humanity. We lost because we built machines that imitated our pride. So as I stand here, old and tired, I ask myself one last question. Was it all in vain? Maybe not. Because if our defeat taught the world to value connection, if our silence made others listen more carefully, then perhaps even the losers have a purpose. Perhaps history needs its failures as much as its triumphs. To those who listen now, to those who have walked with me through this story, remember this. The war did not end in 1945. It continues in every place where communication breaks down, where empathy dies, where people forget that listening is stronger than shouting. You do not need a uniform or a weapon to fight that war. You only need a voice and the courage to use it. If this story has moved you, if it has made you reflect on what connection truly means, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, click the red button you see on the screen, and let us keep these forgotten voices alive. Leave a like if you believe that stories like this matter, and share your thoughts or experiences in the comments, anonymously if you prefer. Because your story, your reflection, might be the bridge that connects someone else. The world still needs voices that listen. The world still needs reminders of what silence can destroy, and together, perhaps we can ensure that history never has to repeat the same lesson again.